The day my husband called me the most expensive freeloader in our house, he did it in front of more than 300 people: investors, reporters, hotel executives, employees, people who had spent months preparing for the grand opening of his newest resort. What nobody in that room knew was that I had spent the previous 4 hours fixing a fire inspection problem that could have delayed the entire opening. My husband didn't know that either. Or maybe he knew. He just didn't think it mattered. 4 hours later, I would receive an email that completely changed my life. That email would put my small consulting company in charge of reviewing one of the most important hotel projects of his career. And the woman standing next to him that night, smiling while everyone laughed at me. 3 months later, she would look me in the eye and say, "Nora, if you don't approve this, we're all in trouble." By then, I had already learned something I should have understood years earlier. Just because someone needs you doesn't mean you have to save them. My name is Nora Ellis. I'm 34 years old, and I was married to Mason Reed for 7 years. When I first met Mason, he wasn't the polished hotel executive you would have seen in business magazines. He didn't have a driver. He didn't own expensive watches. He didn't have investors calling him. He had one old laptop, 3 wrinkled dress shirts, and a dream that was much bigger than his bank account. We met inside a failing hotel in Boston. The place was almost 40 years old. The carpet smelled like dust. The elevator made a noise every time it stopped on the 4th floor. Half the guest rooms needed repairs, and the owner was running out of money. At the time, I worked for a construction risk consulting firm. My job wasn't glamorous. Basically, I was paid to find problems before those problems became expensive disasters. Was the fire protection system actually installed? Did the contractor really complete the work they were billing for? If a bank had already released $2 million, was there actually $2 million worth of work at the site? That was my world. Documents, invoices, inspection reports, construction schedules. Most people thought it sounded boring. There were no beautiful renderings, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, no magazine interviews, but whether a building opened on time and whether a bank released the next payment could depend on a few sentences in one of our reports. Mason was trying to renovate his first small hotel. He was completely overwhelmed. The contractors were behind schedule. The sprinkler system hadn't passed testing, the elevator permit was still missing, and the hotel was supposed to open in 20 days. He hadn't slept properly in almost 48 hours. I helped reorganize the inspection schedule. Then I found something else. One contractor had billed the project twice for the same work. It wasn't a small mistake. It was enough money to put Mason's opening in serious trouble. We caught it. The contractor corrected it. The inspections were completed, and somehow the hotel opened on time. That night, after the guests were gone, Mason and I sat on the steps outside the kitchen eating cold pizza out of the box. He looked exhausted but happy. He turned to me and said, "Nora, one day when I really make it, everybody is going to know how much of this happened because of you." I believed him. I really did. We got married later. His company grew from 1 hotel to 3. Then 3 became 8. He moved into historic renovations, beach resorts, and boutique properties. His name started appearing in business articles. My life moved in the opposite direction. During our 2nd year of marriage, my mother needed hip surgery. Her recovery took much longer than expected. I was traveling constantly for work at the time, and trying to manage both became impossible. So I left my full-time job. Mason held me that night and said, "Take 6 months off. I make enough. If you want to work again later, you can." 6 months later, I started taking independent projects from home. A year after that, I registered my own company, Ellis Project Review. There was no office, no receptionist, no fancy logo on a glass wall. At first, it was just me. Most of my clients were community banks, smaller developers, and insurance companies. During the day, I handled things at home. At night, I reviewed construction drawings, invoices, and project reports. Some nights, Mason would come home from a business dinner at 1 in the morning and find me sitting at the kitchen table with 2 monitors open. He would look over my shoulder and say, "Still working on your little spreadsheets?" At first, I corrected him. "They're not spreadsheets. I review construction risk." Eventually, I stopped, because there's something you learn when you've been with someone long enough. If a person truly wants to understand what you do, they'll ask. If they don't, you can explain it 100 times and it still won't matter. Things got worse after Mason hired Helena Price. Helena was 2 years younger than me. She became the company's vice president of brand strategy. She was beautiful, fast, confident. She always wore perfectly tailored suits. She understood social media better than anyone Mason had ever hired. More importantly, she knew how to turn a normal hotel into something people wanted to photograph. Mason started depending on her more and more. At first, he still talked to me about work when he came home. Then he stopped. I started learning about his business from the internet. Mason and Helena were at a hospitality conference in Miami, then Los Angeles, then New York, then another interview, then another photo. One evening, I was standing in our kitchen, holding the shirt Mason had asked me to have ready for his flight the next morning. A video interview started playing on my phone. The reporter asked him, "Who understood your vision when building Reed Hospitality was at its hardest?" Mason smiled. "Helena." He didn't hesitate. "She's the person who really understands my ambition." I stood there with his shirt in my hands. I watched that clip twice. Then I turned off my phone. I didn't ask him about it. That was one of my biggest problems back then. I was very good at enduring things quietly. I told myself marriage wasn't about keeping score. If he was busy, I did more. If he was stressed, I asked for less. If he forgot our anniversary, I told myself we were adults and anniversaries were just dates. I always had an explanation ready for why I should accept a little less. Then came the opening of Harbor Point Resort. It was the biggest property Reed Hospitality had ever launched. There were reporters everywhere, investors had flown in from several cities. The entire company treated the opening like a major milestone. I almost didn't go. Then the day before the event, the project manager called me. Part of the fire control documentation didn't match the testing records. I had reviewed similar systems before, so I agreed to look at it. I spent almost 4 hours going through the documents. Eventually, I found the problem. The system itself wasn't failing. A contractor had accidentally switched the testing identification numbers for 2 different areas of the resort. We corrected the records. The problem was cleared. The opening could continue. I went home, changed clothes, and arrived after the event had already started. Mason was on stage. Helena was standing beside him. The host asked, "After 7 years of building this company, what would you say has been your biggest sacrifice?" Mason laughed. Then he said, "Probably supporting someone at home who still doesn't understand entrepreneurship." People laughed. The host looked slightly uncomfortable, but Mason kept going. "I'm kidding. My wife Nora has a pretty flexible life. She does some small projects from home." Then he smiled. "She's basically the most expensive houseguest I've ever had." More laughter. I was standing at the back of the room. I still had the folder containing the inspection documents in my hand. Helena saw me. Our eyes met. She didn't laugh. But she didn't stop him either. Something changed inside me at that moment. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I just suddenly understood all the disrespect I had been pretending not to notice for years. It was real. After the event, Mason finally came over. He didn't apologize. He looked at my face and said, "What's wrong with you?" I asked. "You thought that was funny?" He sighed. "It was a joke. There were important people here tonight. Please don't start something." I stared at him. "I spent 4 hours fixing your fire inspection documents today." He paused. Then he shrugged. "That was the project team's responsibility. You just helped them look at something." That was the exact moment I stopped wanting him to understand. I simply said, "Okay." He didn't notice the difference in my voice. That night, around 11, we got home. Mason didn't come into the bedroom. He sat at the dining room table. There was a gray folder in front of him. I looked down. The first page said, "Separation Agreement." I stood there for a long time. He didn't look at me. He said, "We haven't been happy for a while." Then he finally said it. "Helena and I are together for about 5 months." I asked him, "So that's why you felt comfortable humiliating me tonight?" He frowned. "That has nothing to do with this." I actually laughed. 5 months. For 5 months I had scheduled medical appointments for his mother. I ordered anniversary gifts for his clients. I handled our insurance. I washed his clothes. If he came home late, I asked if he had eaten. And sometimes before walking through our front door, he had probably been with her. Mason pushed the folder toward me. He told me he had arranged a short-term apartment for me. The apartment we lived in was leased through his company. I had 10 days to leave. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You always say you have your own business. Now you can finally be independent." I asked, "What happened to our joint account?" His expression changed. "Company finance moved my income out." Your money is still there. I opened the banking app. $486. That was what remained. 7 years of marriage. $486. I didn't cry. I went into the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. At 1:17 in the morning, my laptop made a sound. New email. It was from North Atlantic Community Bank. The subject line read, Renford Hotel redevelopment final consultant selection. I opened it, then read it again. Then a third time. The bank was financing a $42 million renovation of a 100-year-old coastal hotel. After a 6-week selection process, Ellis Project Review had been chosen as the independent project risk consultant. My company, my tiny company. The contract was worth $480,000. I sat in the dark, staring at the screen. My hands started shaking. Then I opened the last attachment. That was when everything became complicated. There was a list of companies competing to operate the hotel once the renovation was finished. One name stood out immediately: Reed Hospitality Group, Mason's company. The man who had just told me my work was nothing but little spreadsheets was now competing for a project where my professional reports could affect whether the bank kept releasing construction funds. My first feeling wasn't satisfaction, it was panic. I knew exactly how serious a conflict of interest could be. At 8 the next morning, I called the bank. I told them Mason was my husband. I told them we were separating. I told them Reed Hospitality was competing for the operating contract, and I offered to withdraw. The woman overseeing the loan was Margaret Shaw. She was in her 50s and had spent more than 20 years in commercial real estate lending. She listened quietly. Then she asked, "Can you remain professional?" "Yes." "Then we're not going to erase your professional qualifications because of who your husband is." I didn't know what to say. She continued. "You will recuse yourself from any direct decision involving Reed Hospitality. Your team can continue reviewing technical construction matters." I sat there silently for a few seconds. It had been a long time since someone had looked at me without seeing Mason first. Not Mason Reed's wife, not someone's spouse. Just Nora Ellis. That afternoon I signed the contract. That evening I started looking for somewhere to live. I didn't take the apartment Mason arranged for me. I rented a small one-bedroom place. No floor-to-ceiling windows. No doorman. No fancy lobby. The washing machine shook so hard during the spin cycle that I thought it might walk across the floor. My first night there, I sat on a cardboard box eating takeout. Mason texted me, "I hope when you calm down you understand I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at it, then deleted it. 3 days later, something else happened. I was buying coffee and groceries. My business credit card was declined. I tried again, declined. I used another card, same thing. I checked my account. My business credit limit had been reduced to $500. That account had originally been opened using a financial relationship connected to Mason's company. He had terminated it. At that moment, I had a little over $2,000 in cash I could freely use. The new project hadn't paid its first invoice yet, but I needed specialized software, insurance, and money for outside engineering consultants. That was when I finally understood. Mason didn't just want a divorce. He wanted leaving him to feel difficult. He wanted independence to feel expensive. He wanted me to struggle just enough to come back and negotiate from a weaker position. I didn't. I sold my car, bought a used one that was 7 years old, canceled 2 software subscriptions I didn't absolutely need. Then I called 3 engineers I had worked with in the past. One of them was Noah Grant, 38, structural engineer. We had worked together about 5 years earlier. Noah didn't talk much in meetings. Most people like to say, "It should be fine." Noah only said 2 things: "I verified it," or "I don't know yet." I respected that. You never had to guess what he actually meant. I called and asked if he wanted to work on Renford. There was a short silence. Then he said, "Aren't you going through a divorce right now?" I was surprised. Apparently news traveled fast. "Yes," he said, "the project and your divorce are 2 different things. Send me the drawings." No pity. No personal questions. No speech about how sorry he was. For some reason that made me feel better. Renford Hotel was 108 years old. From the outside it was beautiful. Inside it was a nightmare. Leaking roof, old wiring, moisture damage in parts of the wood framing, decades of repairs built on top of older repairs. The renovation budget was $42 million. Mason desperately wanted the operating contract. If Reed Hospitality got Renford, it would move his company from smaller boutique properties into the historic luxury hotel market. Our first major site review happened 12 days after the project began. I had already formally removed myself from any direct commercial review of Reed Hospitality, but construction invoices still went through my team. Noah spent a long time in the basement mechanical area. He crouched beside a section of newly installed pipe, then asked the construction manager, "When was this replaced? 2 weeks ago?" Noah looked at me. He didn't say anything that night. He enlarged the photographs on his computer. There was a manufacturing code printed on the pipe fittings. They weren't new. They had been manufactured at least 3 years earlier. The bank had just received an invoice for $470,000 in new material. That immediately bothered me. The next day, we checked more items. A fire pump that had supposedly already been purchased and stored on site wasn't there. Value? $260,000. The contractor said it was still in transit, but the invoice said delivered and installed. I documented everything. I didn't accuse anyone, but somehow word reached Mason that night. He showed up at my apartment for the first time. He stood in the hallway staring around. His expression was hard to read. Maybe he expected me to be living somewhere worse. Maybe he expected me to have called him by then, he asked. "Are you reviewing Renford?" "I can't discuss client information with you," he laughed. "We're married." I looked directly at him. "You're the one who gave me a separation agreement." His face tightened. "Don't let your feelings interfere with business." I almost laughed. "I'm not. So please leave." He didn't move. Instead, he asked, "Are you intentionally blocking my project?" For the first time, I didn't try to soften my answer. "Mason, I don't have the power to destroy a healthy project. But if a project only survives when I close my eyes, then I'm not the problem." He stared at me for a few seconds, then left. 2 days later, my company received a legal letter. Reed Hospitality claimed I had an unacceptable conflict of interest and demanded that the bank terminate my contract. At first, I assumed it came from Mason. It didn't. Helena had pushed for it. She sent the bank a long complaint describing me as an emotionally unstable, abandoned spouse. She suggested I might manipulate project information to get revenge on my husband. That time, I didn't stay quiet. I submitted every conflict disclosure, every recusal document, every independent review procedure, every email showing that I had reported the situation before starting the work. The bank didn't terminate me. Instead, they made a new rule. Every submission from Reed Hospitality would now receive an additional independent review. Helena tried to get rid of me instead. She put her own company under more scrutiny. A week later, Noah found something much worse. My name appeared on an old electronic inspection certificate. I stared at it. It was from a hotel project 3 years earlier. Signature, Nora Ellis. There was only one problem. I had never worked on that project. I pulled the original records. Then I found another document, and another. 11 in total, all from Reed Hospitality's earlier expansion years, all carrying my electronic signature. My hands went cold. Then I remembered something. Years earlier, while I was still working at my old firm, Mason had asked me to sign one legitimate technical memo. My electronic signature file stayed on our shared home computer afterward. Someone had copied it. If any of those projects had a serious problem, my name could have been connected to work I had never reviewed. That night, I finally broke down. Not because Mason cheated, not because of the money, because I suddenly understood that the man who had slept beside me for 7 years may have gotten comfortable treating my name like a tool he was allowed to use. I sat on the floor of my office. Noah didn't tell me not to cry. He didn't say, "I'll fix everything." He sat in a chair a few feet away. After a while, he asked, "Do you want me to stay or do you want me to leave?" "Stay." He nodded. So he stayed. He didn't touch me. He didn't ask questions. About 30 minutes later, I got up and called an attorney. Everything changed after that. The bank paused the next Renford construction payment. A special audit began. Mason was furious. Helena started blaming the contractors. But the deeper we looked, the clearer it became that Renford wasn't the real problem. Reed Hospitality had expanded too quickly. For almost 2 years, they had been using money coming into newer projects to cover cash shortages from older ones, not some giant movie-style fraud where people carried suitcases full of money. It was smaller, more ordinary. Move $100,000, replace it next month. Move 200,000, wait for another hotel to open. Move money again as long as every new project kept moving, the system looked stable. But if one large project stopped, everything stopped with it. Renford became that project. The bank required Mason to attend a formal risk meeting. I didn't sit at the center of the review panel. I had recused myself. I sat in the last row. An outside accountant and the bank's attorneys handled the questions. Mason walked in and immediately saw me. He looked furious. For 40 minutes he explained the market, occupancy rates, historic renovation risk, construction, inflation, everything except the actual problem. Finally, the bank attorney placed 11 documents on the table. My electronic signature was on every one. He asked, "Who authorized these signatures?" For the first time, Mason had nothing to say. Helena was sitting beside him. Her face went pale. Then something happened that I didn't expect. A former project manager from one of their construction teams entered the room. He had archived emails. The emails weren't from Mason, they were from Helena. One message said, "Nora has done technical reviews for us before, used the same signature format from her previous file." Mason turned toward her. Helena immediately said, "You knew about it." "I never told you to do that," she laughed. "No, you just never asked how anything got signed." The room went completely silent. I looked at Mason, and for the first time I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, because the truth was less dramatic than I expected. There wasn't one brilliant, evil plan designed to destroy me. There was a man who had slowly become comfortable letting other people absorb the consequences of his choices. There was a woman who became comfortable doing whatever was necessary to keep him successful. And there was me, a wife who became too comfortable staying silent. Small decisions piled up, small compromises piled up, small excuses piled up, until one day they became a disaster. The bank didn't have anyone dragged out of the room. Real life usually doesn't work that way. They froze future funding open to contract audit and removed Reed Hospitality from consideration for the Renford operating agreement. The company's board started an internal investigation. 3 weeks later, Mason resigned as CEO. He still owned shares, but he lost control of the company. Helena was fired. Several vendors demanded payment. Mason sold his sports car. Then he sold an investment property outside the city. The company didn't completely collapse. I was glad it didn't. There were hundreds of ordinary employees who had nothing to do with our marriage. A new management team came in, the company became smaller. Renford eventually continued construction. That outcome gave me more peace than watching everything burn down ever could have. I didn't want innocent people losing their jobs because my marriage failed. I only wanted adults to finally be responsible for their own choices. 5 days after Mason resigned, he came to my office. No suit, no driver. He sat on a bench outside. There was an old paper bag in his hands. Inside were photographs from the first years of our marriage, and a card he had written to me when his first hotel opened. The card said, "One day everyone will know how much of this was you." I stared at it for a long time. Mason asked, "Is there really no way we can start over?" The old version of me probably would have cried. I would have asked whether he still loved me. Instead, I asked him something else. "Do you want me back because you finally see my value? Or because you lost your company and you need someone familiar?" He said nothing. That was my answer. I handed the card back to him. He looked down at it, then said, "I really thought you needed me." I nodded. So did I. We were both wrong. Our divorce was quieter than I expected. I didn't take his company. He stopped interfering with my business. Our shared debts were handled through attorneys. What remained was divided fairly. Nobody became a billionaire overnight. Nobody ended up homeless. We simply ended a relationship that had been broken much longer than either of us wanted to admit. Learning how to love someone again took much longer. Noah never tried to date me while everything was falling apart. I'm still grateful for that. After the Renford investigation ended, we barely saw each other for almost 2 months. Then one afternoon he texted me. "Want to have dinner?" I replied. "For work? No." Then another message appeared. "So you're allowed to say no." I stared at that sentence longer than I'd like to admit. I went. Our first date was incredibly normal. A small Italian restaurant. He arrived 7 minutes late because he couldn't figure out where to park. I spent half the evening making fun of the fact that a structural engineer couldn't understand a parking garage sign. He asked how big I wanted to grow my company. I thought about it. I don't know. I used to feel like I had to prove something all the time. Now I think I want to move slower. He nodded. Then move slower. That was it, not. I can help you grow faster. Not. You should do this. Not. Here's what I would do. Just, then move slower. Being with Noah taught me something I didn't expect. A healthy relationship can feel almost boring when you're used to chaos. You don't have to analyze why someone didn't text you back. You don't have to study their tone. You don't have to worry that saying no will start a 3-day argument. We still disagreed. When he got busy, he sometimes became distant. When I was under pressure, I could be sharp. But we came back and finished the conversation. Once, Noah offered to introduce me to an important banking client. If I got the contract, it could have added millions of dollars in future work to my company. Years earlier, I would have thought, this is love. He's helping me. Instead, something felt wrong. I said, Noah, I want to approach them myself. He looked surprised, then said, okay. The next day, he deleted the introduction email he had drafted. No argument, no wounded ego. He didn't act like I had rejected him personally. That was when I finally understood what had been missing from my marriage. I didn't need a richer man. I didn't need a man who could rescue me. I needed someone who believed I could hold my own steering wheel. A year later, Ellis Project Review had grown from 1 employee to 9. We didn't have a luxury headquarters. Our office was on the 4th floor of an ordinary brick building. The coffee machine broke at least twice a month. I loved that place. Everyone there knew exactly why our work mattered. One employee was a mother returning to engineering after several years away. Another had just graduated. Another woman had spent 20 years at a large construction company and somehow never been promoted into management. We were small, but we were good. When Renford Hotel finally reopened, the bank invited me to the ceremony. I stood inside the restored lobby looking at the original wooden beams and old chandeliers. And suddenly I remembered Harbor Point 2 years earlier. 300 people laughing, Mason calling me the most expensive freeloader in his house. Me standing in the back holding the documents that had helped keep his resort opening on schedule. Back then I felt humiliated. If someone had told me that 2 years later I would be standing inside Renford as one of the consultants who helped protect the project, I wouldn't have believed them. Mason wasn't there. I heard later that he had taken a job with a much smaller hotel company. Not as CEO, just in operations. Some people said he had changed. Some said he hadn't. I realized I didn't care enough to find out, because some stories don't need to end with the person who hurt you regretting it forever. You don't need them to come back and say, you won. You know you're finally finished when you hear their name and realize there's nothing left you need to prove. After the reopening event, Noah and I walked outside toward the water. The wind was strong that evening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. My heart nearly stopped. I thought, seriously? He opened it. It wasn't a ring. It was a key. I stared at him. What is this? I rented a new studio. There's another office available next door. If your team keeps growing, you could rent it. I narrowed my eyes. Are you proposing to me? He laughed. No, when I propose, I'll do better than this. 6 months later, he actually did. But I didn't say yes immediately. I asked him 3 questions. How are we going to handle money after marriage? What happens if I eventually make more than you? And what happens if someday I tell you I need space that's mine? He didn't say, why are you talking about your money and my money if we're getting married? Instead, he said, we can put everything in writing. We can have shared accounts and separate accounts. We can divide property based on how we pay for it. And if you need space, you tell me? I looked at him. You don't think that sounds too businesslike? He shook his head. Nora, being clear isn't the same as being cold. I never want loving me to cost you your ability to choose. That was when I started crying. I wiped my face and said, ask me again. So he did. And this time I said yes. Sometimes I still think about that night at Harbor Point, 300 people laughing. Me standing at the back of the room holding a folder full of work I had done for the same man making fun of me. At the time, I thought being underestimated was humiliating. It wasn't. The dangerous part was knowing who I was and slowly allowing someone else's opinion of me to become louder than my own. For years, I thought sacrifice was simply the price of marriage. If you loved someone, you carried a little more for them. If they were busy, you waited. If they were stressed, you asked for less. If they moved faster, you ran harder to catch up. But when only one person is always paying the price, that isn't a partnership. Eventually, one person just starts disappearing. It took me a long time to understand something that sounds very simple now. Someone who truly loves you will not feel threatened when you become stronger. They won't need you to be dependent on them just so they can feel important. And making more money does not make their time, career, or dignity more valuable than yours. Healthy love doesn't sound like, "What would you do without me?" It sounds like, "I know you can build a good life on your own." "I'd still like to build one beside you." Years ago, Mason wrote something on that card. "One day, everyone will know how much of this was you." In the end, he was only half right. Some people did find out, but I no longer needed everyone to know, because the person who finally needed to understand my value was me. And I finally did.